Have you ever noticed how the phrase, "I'm fine," has become a kind of social password? A person may be falling apart inside, yet they say, "I'm fine," feeling lost, exhausted, overwhelmed, but still smiling and repeating, "Everything's okay." Except it's not. And the most dangerous part, the more you say it, the more you start to believe it. And the more you believe it, the farther you drift from the one person who truly needs to hear the truth, yourself. Carl Jung used to say, the ego builds masks to survive, but the cost of that is the silence of the soul. And the phrase, "I'm fine," when it isn't true, becomes exactly that. A beautiful mask that hides the emptiness. You think you're protecting yourself, but in reality, you're betraying yourself. And what happens to someone who spends a lifetime ignoring how they feel? The body gets sick. Relationships lose their depth. Joy fades into numbness. And suddenly, life becomes a quiet burden, and you don't even know why. But what if I told you there's another way? A path that begins with the courage to stop pretending, to listen to what's truly stirring within, and to awaken parts of yourself that have been asleep for years. This video is a map, a calling, a mirror, and if you dare to look until the end, you might discover that things were never really fine, and that might be the best beginning of your life. The danger of saying, "I'm fine." You know that automatic phrase we say on autopilot? "I'm fine." It sounds harmless, so common, but it carries a silent power that can stall the soul. When someone says it without really feeling it, they shut an invisible door inside, a door that once led to transformation. By claiming everything's fine, even when your chest is heavy, your eyes avoid contact, and your body is screaming, you unknowingly disconnect from your own collective unconscious and block the healing flow. It's like putting a band-aid over a wound that actually needs deep stitches. Carl Jung would say this is the exact moment the ego takes over and silences the voice of the self. And the worst part, the more you repeat it, the more you believe it. And the more you believe it, the less you listen to your own soul. In practice, this creates an invisible prison. You wear the persona, smile at others, keep functioning socially, but inside, you're in pieces. So how do you break this cycle? First, it takes courage to admit, "No, I'm not okay." You don't have to shout it out to the world, just start within. A helpful exercise is to write a letter every day for 5 minutes, a letter you'll never send, saying exactly what you feel. Or listen to songs that express emotions you've buried. This small practice starts to loosen the ego's knots, because the ego craves control, image, stability. But the soul is movement. Denying that is denying the spiritual nature of your existence. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away. Often, when someone says, "I'm fine," what they're really feeling is fear. Fear of seeming weak, out of place, or even ungrateful. This fear is born from a culture that glorifies emotional performance, being strong all the time, always productive, always ready with the right answer. But this suffocates what's human in us. Carl Jung warned us long ago, what you resist persists. And when you resist your pain, it doesn't go away. It just hides, slipping into the basement of your unconscious, only to resurface as anxiety, addictions, psychosomatic symptoms. So the real question isn't, "Are you okay?" The real question is, what inside of me is begging to be heard? Sometimes, simply admitting to yourself that you're confused, tired, or lost can open a sliver of light. And that sliver is where shadow work begins, even if only gently. The illusion that everything's fine creates a false sense of stability, and the danger is that it blocks growth. True spirituality doesn't come from polished answers, but from honest questions. Someone who keeps saying, "I'm fine" all the time doesn't give their soul the chance to scream, to let the unconscious bring forth what needs to emerge. That's when the silent sickness sets in, chronic boredom, loss of purpose. Life itself then takes over the task of shaking us awake. A breakup, a job loss, an existential crisis. The soul finds its ways, and they're not always soft, to call us back to center. It's fascinating how often in moments of collapse, a teacher appears. Not in the traditional sense, but someone whose mere presence makes you fall silent and begin to listen. That's the kind of wisdom we're going to talk about now. The wisdom of Rakim wasn't an ordinary man. In fact, almost no one knew where he came from. He didn't speak much, didn't make speeches, didn't try to convince anyone of anything. But his presence alone stirred something deep in those who met him. Rakim carried silence on his shoulders. Not an empty silence, but one filled with meaning, spirituality, and deep listening. He understood that true masters don't teach with words, but through the vibration they emanate. Carl Jung said the most essential things can't be taught, only lived. And Rakim, with his calm presence, seemed to live in constant communion with the collective unconscious, seeing far beyond what ordinary eyes could perceive. But the vain were often unsettled by him. They would challenge his wisdom with intellectual questions, trying to prove themselves right. But Rakim never answered directly. He responded with metaphors, gestures, and disorienting stories. One day, someone asked him the secret to happiness. He picked up a dry leaf from the ground, blew on it gently, and said, "It didn't resist the wind. That's why it flew." Then he fell silent. And it was that kind of response that made the proud tremble, because it couldn't be argued with. He didn't speak to people's egos, he spoke to their souls, and those disconnected from themselves felt that like a jolt. It's interesting how, on our path, the true masters often aren't the ones shouting or flashing wisdom online. They're the ones who disarm us with their calm. Rakim showed that the greatest sign of wisdom isn't reacting to noise, but listening to what lies behind it. He was like a clear mirror, not reflecting what you wanted to see, but what you needed to. And in that reflection, many found their shadows. In fact, shadow work is exactly that, sitting silently in front of your inner mirror, stripped of emotional makeup, and facing what's there. It's uncomfortable, but transformative. And Rakim taught that not with lectures, but through his very way of being. Perhaps that's why he was so rare. Rakim's silent wisdom can be applied in everyday life in simple ways. When someone provokes you, don't react. Observe. When you feel the urge to prove something, ask yourself, who am I trying to impress? Practice intentional silence for 10 minutes a day. Not just external silence, but internal. No music, no phone, no expectations. Just listen. This practice is a form of active meditation and a way to reconnect with the self. Slowly, you'll realize that many of your impulses aren't truly yours. They come from the persona you learned to wear to please the world. And when this silence starts to make sense, something fragile inside you begins to grow in value, the awareness that life, like a glass vase, is delicate and deserves to be handled with care. The metaphor of the glass vase. Imagine holding in your hands a delicate, antique glass vase of incalculable value. With every step, you need to be fully present. One slip, one moment of haste, one distraction, and it could shatter. That vase represents your inner life, and most people carry it as if it were made of plastic, sturdy, replaceable. They forget that emotions, connections, the sense of meaning, all of it is fragile. Carl Jung said the soul is like a sensitive structure that needs to be approached with reverence. When we treat our spirituality as something disposable, it's not the vase that breaks, it's the self's trust. That's why so many live patching up emotional cracks without even knowing where they came from. Some only realize how fragile life is once everything is already in pieces. When the relationship ends, when the body breaks down, when loneliness screams. Then they try to glue the shards back together in a rush, like sweeping dust under the rug. But a cracked glass vase needs more than glue. It needs patience, care, time, silence. Shadow work is exactly that. The practice of carefully observing each fracture in your inner structure and asking what caused it. It's uncomfortable, yes, but far wiser than trying to replace the vase, as the ego usually suggests. The ego wants speed, results, image. The soul wants depth. And there's no depth without delicacy. Taking care of that vase in real life means slowing down, sleeping better, listening to music that nourishes the soul, saying no more often, saying yes only to what truly expands you. It means understanding that every emotion, even the unpleasant ones, is a reminder of the sensitivity that lives within you. And sensitivity isn't weakness, it's ancient wisdom. In Eastern traditions, there are millennia-old practices for caring for vital energy. In Japan, kintsugi is the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the cracks part of the beauty, a perfect metaphor for the spiritual journey. Instead of hiding your fractures, the true seeker learns to honor them because they tell the story of who you're becoming. And when you start to see life as a delicate glass vase, you also begin to question where you're placing your hands, in which relationships, which environments, which thoughts. Spirituality stops being an abstract concept and becomes a daily practice in every decision. The world, so fast-paced and competitive, will always try to push you into a rigid, insensitive, disconnected stance. But what will you do with that? Will you harden or preserve yourself? Will you act like glass or like stone? These questions open space to see beyond attachment. Because often, it's in the fear of losing the vase that we become slaves to what we think we possess. Attachment as the ego's illusion. The ego has a well-rehearsed trick. It whispers that everything you love must last forever, but in reality, that's like trying to bottle the wind. Attachment is born from this illusion, the belief that we'll only be happy if the other person stays, if the job remains, if youth never fades. Carl Jung said the ego builds its fortresses around permanence, while the self flows with impermanence. And that's where the conflict lives. The ego wants guarantees, but the soul wants freedom. Attachment isn't love, it's holding tight out of fear. And where there's fear, there's no presence, only control. A control disguised as affection, but that ends up suffocating everything that's alive. Attached people live in fear. Fear that something will change, that someone will leave, that what they think they have will transform. And the tragedy is that fear doesn't stop change. It only blocks lightness. When you attach yourself to an identity, I'm this, to a role, I'm the best at that, to a fixed idea of happiness, the ego grows stronger, but your being weakens. Shadow work is about observing these invisible contracts we make with the world. I can only feel safe if this continues to exist. But that's a trap. Everything changes, everything dissolves, everything slips away. True self-knowledge begins when you realize you are not what you have, or what you do, or what you appear to be. You are what remains when everything else is gone. Want a practical example? Think of times when you felt devastated after losing something, a phone, a relationship, an opportunity. Now ask yourself, what really hurt? Was it the absence of that thing, or what your mind projected onto it? Maybe the phone represented status, the relationship, self-worth, the opportunity, a sense of deserving. It wasn't the object, it was the meaning the ego attached to it. So a powerful practice is to revisit your attachments and ask, if I lost this today, who would I still be? Reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle or Letting Go by Lama Surya Das can open internal windows, not to make you cold, but to teach you how to love without possessing, to be without clinging, to feel without drowning. And as you begin to let go, something curious happens. The less you cling, the freer you become. And the freer you are, the more deeply you love, because you're no longer loving to hold on, but to expand. This kind of love is rare, and it only blooms when the ego stops demanding and starts observing. Real spirituality begins when we stop resisting the flow and start listening to the movement of the unconscious, because it's always moving, especially when we're distracted. That's why many of life's deepest transformations come during a crisis, when what we most wanted to hold on to slips through our fingers, and what looked like an ending becomes a beginning. Transformations triggered by the unconscious. No one wakes up one day and decides, I'm going to completely change my life. That's not how transformation works. The big shifts don't come from rational decisions. They come from the invisible force of the unconscious, dragging us where the soul needs to go, even as the ego kicks and screams. Carl Jung said, "What is not brought to consciousness comes back as fate." That's why so many crises strike when we least expect it. A breakup, a death, a job loss, an emotional collapse. Sometimes it's the entire collective unconscious manifesting all at once, blowing up everything that was stuck. Why? Because the soul can't stand being imprisoned for too long. Pain in these moments isn't punishment, it's language. Loss is a sign. Crisis is a map. Life isn't punishing you, it's calling you. It's as if a deeper part of yourself, long ignored, comes knocking and says, now you're going to listen. And that voice doesn't come gently, it comes like an earthquake. That's why shadow work isn't a light stroll. It's a dive into chaos. Chaos not as destruction, but as a reset. A call to realignment. And everything the ego tries to protect out of fear, the unconscious tears down with wisdom, because it knows if the structure doesn't collapse, the soul won't grow. And yes, growth hurts, but not growing hurts even more. In practical terms, how can you tell if the unconscious is trying to speak? Pay attention to repeating patterns, emotions that arise out of nowhere, intense dreams. That nagging feeling something is off, even when everything seems fine. That's where the self starts to reveal itself. Living spirituality shows up in these subtle signals. A good practice is to keep a dream journal, track recurring symbols, names, emotions that stand out. Or read books like Man and His Symbols by Jung, which teach you how to decode these silent messages. You don't need grand mystical revelations. You just need to start listening to what's already screaming, just in another language. And once the unconscious speaks, nothing stays the same. Friendships change, tastes change, even your voice changes, because the soul is finally taking the lead. It's like life finally starts being lived from the inside out. But this is where many people get stuck, because after the collapse comes the void. And the void isn't comfortable, but it's precisely in that moment, when everything feels too quiet, too calm, too uncertain, that true wisdom begins to take shape. And that's exactly what one of the three brothers discovered when he lost what he loved most. The story of the three brothers. It's said that three brothers were walking together down a long road through the desert of life. The eldest was proud and clung to the past. The middle one sought safety in everything. The youngest was restless, curious, and quiet. One day, they lost everything. A sudden accident took away their possessions, their certainties, even some of the people they loved. Each reacted in their own way. The eldest grew bitter, blamed fate, and sank into resentment. The middle one tried to rebuild everything as it was before, as if he could tape reality back together. But the youngest, he fell silent. He cried for days. Then he began to give thanks, not for the loss, but for the clarity it brought. He understood something the others hadn't yet seen. No external thing could define his inner peace. This story may seem simple, but it holds a deep lesson. Gratitude isn't an automatic feeling, nor a spiritual obligation. It's a practice, a posture, and it becomes a true force only when it's put to the test. That youngest brother began to give thanks daily for small things: the morning sun, cool water on his face, the eyes that still saw, and it was through that habit that he rebuilt his strength. Carl Jung said the unconscious doesn't speak with words, but with symbols and actions. And in that brother, gratitude was the symbol of an awakened spirit, one that no longer needed the ego's guarantees. He realized that everything can change, everything can be lost, but the soul only truly suffers when it forgets to be grateful for what remains. Practically speaking, you can start with 3 small gratitudes each day, but not the generic kind like, "I'm grateful to be alive." Go deeper. "I'm grateful for the silence this morning. I'm grateful for the courage to keep going despite fear. I'm grateful I cried yesterday. It means I'm still feeling." This kind of gratitude isn't a performance. It's spirituality in action. And when it's cultivated even on hard days, something begins to shift inside. Your perspective changes, your energy shifts, and when your inner world changes, your outer world follows. The 2 older brothers went down very different paths. One isolated himself in pride, the other got lost in control. But the youngest, with his simple and consistent practice of gratitude, awakened something greater. He stopped identifying with what he had or what he had lost. And he realized the real power wasn't in owning, but in remaining whole even when everything around him was falling apart. That's the difference between having and being. And from that realization came a new kind of clarity. That true wealth isn't found in titles, but in connection to the inner self. The difference between possessing and identifying: some people have a lot, but are very little, and some have little, but are giants inside. The confusion between having and being is one of the ego's biggest traps in the modern world. From a young age, we're taught to accumulate things: toys, grades, diplomas, followers, job titles. But no one teaches us to ask, of all this, what is truly me? Carl Jung said the individuation process requires us to separate our essential self from the social persona. And that's where many people get stuck, because they become so identified with what they have, their career, their name, their status, that when they lose those things, they feel empty, as if they no longer exist. But the soul is not a resume, and the self doesn't fit on a name badge. Look, there's nothing wrong with owning things. The problem arises when possession becomes identity. When someone says, "I am my job, I am my body, I am my success." That's not the self, that's the reflection of the self. And reflections change. A business person can go bankrupt, an athlete can get injured, an influencer can fade from relevance. And then what? If your identity was tied to all of that, the collapse becomes an existential crisis. That's why spirituality invites us to turn inward, to discover what exists beyond roles. Shadow work at this stage is like removing makeup after a long day, painful for the ego, liberating for the soul. And the more you clean, the more you realize that what's real can't be lost. A simple exercise is to list everything you believe defines you. I'm anxious, I'm good with logic, I'm shy, I'm an engineer, I'm a mom. And then ask yourself, if I lost this today, what would be left? This question helps break the unconscious links between identity and possession. A powerful book to deepen this reflection is I Am That, by Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, which dismantles the illusion of the surface self and takes you straight to your essence. Because when you no longer identify with form, you begin to access substance, what remains even when the world falls apart. And that doesn't mean living with nothing. It means living without needing what you have in order to feel like someone. When you learn to let go of the idea that you have to be someone to have worth, a new space opens, a space of presence, a space where things can come and go, but you no longer lose yourself completely, because you're anchored in who you are, not in your circumstances. And it's in this state that the ego starts to lose strength and the self takes the wheel. But the ego doesn't go down without a fight. It still tries, with wounded pride, to assert itself. And it's in that quiet inner conflict that the biggest breakthrough of all is born, the breaking of pride as the doorway to soul awakening. Soul awakening through the breaking of pride. Pride is the ego's final fortress before the encounter with the self. It disguises itself as strength, but it's fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control, fear of admitting we don't know everything. The proud don't listen, they respond. They don't feel, they analyze, and that's why the soul doesn't bloom there. Carl Jung said, only what is truly ourselves has the power to heal. But pride keeps us from being real. It demands that we keep up appearances, even when everything inside us is crying out for a breakdown. And yet, ironically, it's in that breakdown, when pride finally cracks, that the soul begins to breathe. And that silent breath is where transformation begins. Most people think spiritual awakening comes through blissful moments of light and peace, but often it begins with the opposite, humiliation. That moment when you fail, fall, lose, or feel exposed. The ego screams, panics, tries to save face, but something deeper grows quiet. And in that silence, the soul reveals itself. Not an empty silence, but one full of listening, presence, truth. A good example is someone who went through immense loss, the end of a marriage, a difficult diagnosis, financial ruin, and later says, "That woke me up." Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was so raw, it shattered the masks. You can start accessing that silence with a counterintuitive step. Stop trying to justify yourself all the time. When someone criticizes you, listen. Don't respond right away. Ask yourself, what about this criticism touches me so deeply? Why does it bother me? That's the practice of silencing the ego and tuning into the self. It may seem small, but it's deeply transformative. And if you want to go further, try a week of intentional silence. Not isolation, just speaking less, observing more. This allows the layers of pride to begin dissolving. Books like Stillness Speaks by Eckhart Tolle or Meditations by Marcus Aurelius can help you walk this inner path with clarity and grace. When pride falls silent, your inner space expands, and in that spaciousness, spirituality finds a home. You begin to see you don't need to win every argument or prove anything to anyone. The search is no longer for validation, it's for meaning. And in this new rhythm, you learn to hear life's signals. Because sometimes the soul doesn't scream, it whispers. And those too busy with their own arrogance don't hear it. That's why in certain spiritual paths, silence is more powerful than any mantra. And in that silence, ancient stories emerge, like the one about a caravan lost in the desert. The story of the caravan in the desert legend says a caravan was making its way across the desert, heading toward a sacred city. Among them were merchants, spiritual guides, wanderers and seekers, each looking for something: wealth, answers, miracles. Along the way, the sky grew dark, the wind died down, silence fell, nothing seemed to happen. And that's when the tension started. "Why aren't we moving?" they asked. "Nothing's happening, let's just go." But the oldest among them, a quiet elder named El Haroun, simply watched. He knew when the desert falls silent, it's because something big is coming. But the young leader of the caravan, impatient and arrogant, ignored the signs and decided to push forward. He wanted to prove he was right. And he paid dearly for it. The next morning, a sandstorm swallowed them whole. No direction, no visibility, no shelter. The desert, once calm, showed its true power. That's when many realized the silence before hadn't been emptiness. It was a warning. And those who were prepared survived. El Haroun, with his camels gathered and his eyes steady, crossed the storm as if dancing with it. Not because he was stronger, but because he had listened to the silence. That's the lesson the desert gives. Arrogance is too much inner noise. Wisdom is listening. Carl Jung said the unconscious speaks before it acts. But the ego is always in a rush, always trying to prove something. That's why it gets lost. This story is a perfect metaphor for modern life. How often do you rush forward just because nothing's happening? How many times do you try to force an answer, an outcome, a connection, simply because you can't stand the silence? And when things go wrong, you blame life, or others, or bad luck. But in truth, the desert had already spoken. You just didn't listen. A powerful practice is to train yourself in waiting. Yes, not acting. Go 1 week without making big decisions. Just observe what surfaces. This activates the collective unconscious and pulls you out of the ego's impulsive grip. Read The Tao of Waiting by José Tolentino Mendonça. It's a balm for anyone who struggles with stillness, because sometimes stopping is the most spiritual move there is. And when the storm passes, the sky clears, the dust settles, and those who survived the desert are never the same again. They learned that the path isn't just about moving, it's about knowing when to pause. And more than that, when to bow, because life, even when it seems silent, is always teaching, and the true master isn't the one who knows everything, it's the one who reveres every step of the journey. That reverence changes everything. It brings presence, it brings humility, it brings peace. And with that posture, the seeker finds something deeper than any answer, the living practice of gratitude. Not the performative kind, but the kind that's born from simply being here. Presence and reverence. In the end, life doesn't ask as much of us as we think. It doesn't demand perfection or all the answers. It asks for something subtler, but much more challenging. Presence. To be fully here, where your feet touch the ground, where your eyes are looking, where your heart is beating. But that's rare these days. Most people live with their minds in tomorrow and their souls stuck in yesterday. Carl Jung said meaning disappears when we disconnect from the self, and the self only shows up in the now. There's no spirituality in excessive control, no wisdom in trying to dominate everything. The true path begins when we learn to walk without a map, with reverence for each unknown turn. Reverence is a forgotten word. People confuse it with religion, ceremony, obligation, but reverence is much more than that. It's the ability to look at the world and within with sacred respect. It's shifting from treating life as something you have to manage to something that deserves to be honored. You don't control the rain, the time, or other people, but you can control how you respond to what life brings. That is reverence. That is living spirituality. And you don't need a temple for it. Just wash the dishes with attention. Take a breath before you respond. Look someone in the eye and really listen. These are small acts, but they carry the infinite. In this context, gratitude stops being a superficial thank you and becomes a practice of presence. You're not grateful because everything is great. You're grateful because you're alive, because even with pain, you still feel. Even with fear, you still move forward. Even with uncertainty, you still search. That kind of gratitude is revolutionary. It slowly dissolves the ego, it disarms the persona, and little by little you begin to inhabit your own body with more ease. You begin to realize you're not here to win a race, but to walk a sacred path. And when you accept that, everything changes. Hurry gives way to listening. Pressure turns into acceptance, and disconnection transforms into intimacy with the now. Of course, the world will still try to pull you out of that state. It will scream, demand, rush you, but now you know there's a place inside where your soul can breathe, where the ego has no power, where the shadow is welcomed. That place can only be reached through presence, and staying there is a daily choice, not a perfect one, but an intentional one. This kind of practice separates those who live on autopilot from those who are awakening, from those who say, "I'm fine" without feeling, and those who finally understand the weight of that phrase. Because deep down, saying "I'm fine" might just be a polite way to run from the truth. But what if we had the courage to look it in the eye? Now that you've made it this far, let me ask you sincerely, how many times have you said "I'm fine" when deep down your world was falling apart? How often have you silenced your pain to seem strong, to avoid worrying others, to not feel weak? Have you ever stopped to think how much of your soul has been quieted just to keep up appearances? Maybe now is the time to change, to begin a simple practice. Be honest about what you feel. You don't have to shout it to the world, just admit it to yourself, because that's where healing begins. Healing never comes from denial. It's born from the courage to look, to feel, to stay present. So let me ask you, who are you behind the "I'm fine"? What pain are you hiding behind your smile? What part of you is begging to be heard, embraced, understood? If this video touched something inside you, don't let it pass. Leave a comment with what impacted you the most. It could be a phrase, a memory, a realization. That helps you and inspires whoever reads it too. And of course, if this content resonated with you, if it opened a window inside, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. We'll keep walking this journey of awakening, healing, and reconnecting with what truly matters. Because deep down, you know, your soul was never meant to just survive. It's here to come alive again.